going to go ahead and get a start. And just for the record, this is History Bites, sponsored by the Amherst Historical Society. My name is Bonnie Isman. Today's program features our genesis of our public library system and the book CommonPLACE, the Public Library, Civil Society, and Early American Values, written by Thomas Johnson, who's a local author. And we're very interested in this. It seems like you're looking at the very beginnings of the public library system. And, George provided a quote from de Tocqueville, and de Tocqueville from 1831 says that democracy, in his work, Democracy in America, these voluntary library associations were unlike anything found elsewhere in the world and were a signature feature of the new republic. So here we are with the public library system. Mr. Johnson.
Thank you, Bonnie.
You're welcome.
Let's see if I can back up. So, right, it's a great honor to be here this morning. I have spoken in the past at a number of libraries throughout New England. The Women's Club here in Amherst a week or so ago, but this is the first opportunity to speak before people interested in history writ large and particularly local history. So I will recalibrate my presentation to focus on issues that I hope are of particular interest to you. I won't say much about myself other than this is my first book and probably my last book. I spent about 4 to 5 years writing it, researching it, traveling through the region. And what makes this book unique and hopefully useful is it is written by someone who is not trained as a historian or who is not a library scientist, which is what previous books have involved. And in a minute I'm going to show you 2 really important books to illustrate that. I'm an associate member of the American Library Association and a member of their Library History Roundtable. They have a journal that comes out twice a year, and this book will be reviewed in this journal in the next issue. So hopefully this library, the Jones Library, gets this. So I am going to present for most of the time we have, but I'm going to do it in an interactive way. I'm going to ask you all questions or thoughts, because I think that's a better way to engage an audience. So just be forewarned. Then at the end we'll have a Q&A period of at least 15 minutes. So, the 2 books I want to mention as being very central to my research was this one, Part of Our Lives, A People's History of the American Public Library, by Professor Wayne Wiegand, who is at the University of Florida. This is the most recent and most comprehensive book on the public library system in America. But it's written by a professor of library science, and so he brings obviously that perspective to him. That's one note. The other is that he really focuses sort of on the social aspects of public libraries, which there's nothing wrong with that. But the main difference between his book and my book is that I focused on the when I see the other dimensions of public libraries as an institution in America. So I looked at it through institutional terms. The other difference was that he really focused primarily on big city libraries, in particular the Boston Public Library. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, and we're fortunate to have libraries in our big cities. But my book focuses at the other end of the spectrum on the role, the development and role of public libraries in small cities, towns, and even villages. Some of the places I did my case studies in were very small places. Why did I choose to do that? The main reason is that I believe while public libraries are important wherever they are, proportionally, if I can use that term, they're more important, have been more important, and can be in the future more important in smaller localities across America. I got an email overnight from someone who heard about this book and unfortunately couldn't be here this morning. But his love of public libraries in Massachusetts, Western Massachusetts, led him to start visiting public libraries in this part of the state. Guess how many libraries he has visited so far? 200? No. There may be 200, but 77 so far, on a bike. Yeah. And
Harley?
no, I think a pedal bike, right?
Electric bike.
But that's amazing, because I wouldn't have, each town has a library, right? Or a couple, some have branches. But I wouldn't have even thought there were 77 municipalities or towns in Western Massachusetts. So maybe he's bleeding into the central part of the Commonwealth, I don't know. But in any event, I focus on libraries in small places where the role that they have is particularly important. The other book that was absolutely critical is the first book, the oldest book that is in my bibliography. My bibliography is quite extensive and I think diverse and impressive. This is called The Arsenals of a Democratic Culture by Sidney Ditson, who was a professor of history at City College in New York. And this was published in 1947 by the American Library Association. Does anyone recognize this term? This was a phrase that Franklin Roosevelt used prior to the entry of the United States in World War II, when he said the importance of the United States is that we are really the arsenal for a democratic culture, trying to make the argument for intervening in Europe. And so Ditson appropriated that idea, and this book was a predecessor to my book, and then it looks at the nexus between public libraries and the democratic culture. So it was extremely useful. What's unfortunate is, of course, it's been long out of print. I was able to source a number of reference books, either in the collection here at the Jones, or with their help, locating them in either universities or other public libraries throughout Massachusetts. I got several books from the library at UMass. They could not find this book anywhere in Massachusetts. And I asked them, well, can you search other databases to see if there was some other system, at least on the East Coast, where I might be able to get it? Zilch. So I searched online and found this through a used bookseller. This book came from a public library in Scotland. It was checked out exactly once. But I just thought that was ironic, that they found it in a public library, and Scotland was, of course, important in terms of public library history because of Andrew Carnegie and his roots there. But this book was extremely valuable. By the way, my website, which I really urge you to visit, has an annotated bibliography. So in that, I probably devote more space to this book than any of the other books. There's about 15 in the annotated bibliography. Now, I just want to conclude by saying that the foreword to this book was written by another noted historian who wrote, "The public library is one of the most characteristically American of our major cultural institutions." I couldn't agree more, but I would go on to say that it is not a major cultural institution, but it is a major social and educational institution. Because as we'll hear in a few minutes, one of the reasons it started here, the institution started here in New England, was because America's public education systems started here in New England as well. And there's a link. Okay, so briefly, the book has a foreword, which was written by Noreen Sullivan, who was a past president of the American Library Association, and more recently, the chairperson of the Connecticut State Library Board. I became acquainted with her early in the process of the project through a program funded by the Gates Foundation that she was involved with as an advisor, and she became my principal advisor for the entire period of the research. Put me in touch with the state librarian in Connecticut, with the state librarian in Vermont. She's now basically a consultant, but her network throughout America, and in particular New England, is unsurpassed. I then have a preface where I talk about my reasons for writing the book, and then it goes into an introduction called A Place of Civil and Moral Values. Now at this point, I think it would be useful to define some of the key terms in the book. So let's start with the public library. What does an institution need to have? What are the characteristics of a public library? Do you have any suggestions from the floor?
Well, it's open to the public and it has books.
Okay, so books, it's open to the public. What else?
Anyone can go.
Yes, it's open to the public. The first libraries in America were not open to the public. They were membership only. Some of them even charged people. Others were just, it was sort of a club. And there were some of those social libraries in Europe at the time too.
Do you consider public funding to be a necessary piece, or is that something that there could be a public library
Yes.
that's donation funded?
Taxpayer support.
Ah,
Okay. What else does it need? Think of the basics.
a
It needs-
physical location.
Yes, it needs a building, a dedicated space, because the first public libraries often were above a market. That was the case of the first library in South Amherst prior to the Munson. They need a physical space. What's the last element that they need?
Librarian.
Yes, they need staff, because again, the first public libraries were minimally staffed, and they weren't staffed by professional librarians. They were staffed by volunteers, which was better than nothing. But having a trained staff is now, of course, associated with having a public library. Okay, let's move on to civil society. Can someone give me an example of a civil society organization here in Amherst? Well, one is the group that's sponsoring this talk this morning. Another is the Amherst Friends of the Library. They're all over the place. They're ubiquitous, and you often don't realize, because sometimes you think, well, that's public, but it's actually a civil society organization, which is also known as a nonprofit, which is how the U.S. government characterizes them. But a surprising number of public libraries, as we'll hear, were not only formed by civil society, in fact all the first ones were, but a surprising number are run today by nonprofits, not by the local government. The Munson, when it was created with books and staff and a building in around 1930, was run for the next 22 years by the South Amherst Library Association, the civil society group. Only then was it turned over to the town. So, civil society happens for two reasons. People come together because they have a common interest and they want to explore that or advance it. That would be the Historic Society. Other civil society groups come together for not only a common purpose and interest, but to advance the common good. Okay? The American Red Cross, the Boys and Girls Clubs in America, the YMCA. Those all came together with like-minded people who volunteered their time initially to advance certain values and interests.
Would that also be like the Rotary Club and Seroptimus and
Yes.
Sisters and Junior League, all those?
Those are all civil
One that
society
started
organizations.
like back 80 years ago?
And that's what de Tocqueville noted when he came in around 1833, is he called them then associations, and he was astonished at the difference between America and Europe when it came to these voluntary associations. And he associated that very directly and strongly with the development of democracy here that had not happened in Europe.
Well, I would have thought that there would be a
Asia
whole,
also.
whole angle here of society wanting to save money. Because if they wanted to do a special pie, they could look at a whole bunch of cookbooks
Yes,
and not have to buy them
right.
and decide what pie they're going to make.
Kind of like
Right.
a co-op.
That's right. But that is offered for the common good. You see, so this concept of the common good is central to the public library, just like public schools are. The feeling a better informed public citizenry is integral to a well-functioning democracy.
I think the gentleman's point is good, though, that in some levels it's about self-interest. The difference is self-interest is perceived in ways that benefit all of society as opposed to benefiting only one individual. And I think that's certainly how I'm wired, is that I'm a very self-interested person, and I've actually funded the start of 2 very tiny libraries in Africa with a $50 contribution to each one, which one of them got 13 books for that. Can you imagine? And, you know, but it is in my interest to have people literate in other corners of the world.
Right.
So I think that's what you're trying to get at.
Okay. Well, I wouldn't disagree with that at all. But it's what is special is that happened first here in America. So not only the libraries that are featured in my book were the first in America, but they were the first public libraries anywhere in the world. Shortly after they started appearing here, France, kind of as a result of revolution, started to create a system of municipal libraries, right? So we beat them by a couple years, but what was interesting is these first libraries here were started by people like us because of a common interest in books and reading and a concern for the common good. Whereas in Europe, they were formed and developed and created by the state, which said, this is good, we're going to do it. You know. Whereas in England, incidentally, during that same period, the aristocracy, the leaders in England, were actively trying to keep the common people uneducated. It's astonishing, the difference between England and America. Okay, so the last term are these early American values. We've heard about a couple of them. Promoting the common good. Education was an early American value. Education not just for the elite, but for everyone. Sort of related to that is equality. There was a feeling, right, between the founders. Remember, these first public libraries were popped up right after the Revolution. But there was a strong feeling that for America's nascent democracy to thrive, it required an educated, informed public. And this was before anyone but the very wealthy were able to educate their children. There were no public schools. Okay. So then section 1, and this is where I pop up the next. It talks about the public library in history. Okay. So, as you can see, the first library, although it was not public, was at Harvard University. Does anyone know the backstory of this?
Why not?
Somebody's library.
Why not?
Oh, yeah,
Wait,
somebody's
well,
library.
this was way pre-library.
Mr. Harvard's library.
Huh?
Wasn't it Mr. Harvard's library?
It was John Harvard, a reverend, library books that he donated to the university, and they named him after, they named the institution after him for that donation of books, which is, to me, interesting. So, we don't have time to go through all of these things, but this shows when all 16 libraries that I look at in detail in the book were established. It shows other key points, such as when the New Hampshire State Library was established. That was the first. Benjamin Franklin created his lending library in Philadelphia, but that was not open to the public. That was a club. The Redwood Library in Athenaeum was created in Newport early on. That's still not open to the public. No. The Athenaeum in Pittsfield is now a public library, but not in other locations where they like Newport. So the first public library, widely known, and there's no dispute, was the Franklin Public Library in Massachusetts.
So where is it?
In Franklin, Massachusetts.
Oh,
Okay, so what happened was the town had originally been named something else, you know, Suffolk or something. And when they went to incorporate, they decided, the town fathers decided to change the name to Franklin in recognition of Benjamin Franklin. And a couple of years later, they wrote to him and said, you know, we were the first place in America to name ourselves after you. Would you, in thanks, send us a bell that we can mount over our town meeting hall? And he wrote back and said, well, thank you for the recognition, but I'm not going to send you a bell. But I will send you our books. And so he ordered a shipment of books from England to be sent to Franklin. And the book and the website has pictures of those books that are still in the Franklin Library. And the story is fascinating because they went to the town without saying, these go to, you know, Mr. someone or Reverend whoever. They just were shipped to the town. But the Reverend took possession of them. And he felt the collection should not be made available to anyone outside his congregation, which had a small library for its members. And the rest of the town said, no. Franklin sent this to us, to a community. And this dispute went on for actually several years, until finally, on Christmas Eve in 1790, the town meeting basically had, most of the people in the town there in attendance, and decided, we are going to take those books back and we're going to make them available to the public. It wasn't initially free of charge, but they belong to the public.
Well, Merry Christmas.
Yeah. What a way to start the first library in America. Now, I'll say at this point, based on what I've said, who would you think is the father of the public library in America? Yeah. Do you know what other library he created?
Philadelphia.
Well, he created his lending library.
Library of Congress?
Yes. Yes, sir. The first Library of Congress was in Philadelphia because that's where the Congress was initially. And then when the government moved to Washington, D.C., so did the Library of Congress. And then what happened?
It became an Apple store.
In the War of 1812, the British burned much of Washington, including the Library of Congress. All the books that Franklin had given the library were lost. Then what did they do?
We had a new benefactor,
And who might that be?
the man who can't
Carnegie.
live without books, Jefferson.
That's right. They purchased Jefferson's private collection, and that became the collection of the Library of Congress. Now, the Library of Congress was intended for primary use by whom? By our representatives, by our Congress. Why? So that they would be better informed in their duties. Over the years, though, it's been open to scholars, academics, and one could say even elements of the general public. I mean, anyone can visit it. Checking something out is something else. But in some ways, the Library of Congress is one of the oldest public libraries in America as well.
Have any congressmen in our lifetimes been known to use it?
I think a lot of their staffers probably do. Staffers do much of the work in Congress, as you know, actually. So, Library of Congress, Massachusetts State Library was the second established in the United States. Now, New Hampshire, being the leader up here, was also the leader in passing the first law to permit public tax support. So, in two important ways, New Hampshire was what's in the lead. But why did they do that? They did that because the Peterborough Town Library feels, and there is quite a bit of evidence, that they were the first place in America where the town meeting voted for public support of their library. That's not quite true. The first actually was in Salisbury, Connecticut, at the Scoville Memorial Library, and I say that's been that claim has been legitimized by the U.S. government when the building was applying for a place on the National Historic Register. But the problem was the Scoville closed for a few years. So Peterborough says that they are the longest or the first continuously open public library that has had public support. My research, however, found that just a few years earlier, what is now known as the Carey Memorial Library in Lexington, the citizens there voted for public support. So the question of who was the first or the second is will be left to others, but I uncovered the history of the Carey that had not appeared in any of these books. None of them. So Massachusetts followed very shortly, New Hampshire passing a law to permit tax support. By the way, the citizens in Franklin questioned when they opened their library way back here in 1790 whether they could tax themselves to support the library. And they did not feel that they could do it, and did not, because there was no enabling legislation. So they were big leaders in that history. Boston Public Library happens around 1850. Maine does the tax and so on. So this is Appendix 1 in the book. Now, we come to the important question. Why were these first public libraries, why did they spring up? Why did they develop here in New England and not some other part of the country?
Could it have something to do with the large number of colleges and universities?
Relatively few existed at that point. That was probably part of it. I think we might say there was a greater appreciation of the value of knowledge among the public in New England. One of the reasons was that this is where public education was first blossomed. Does anyone recall who was responsible for that? Horace Mann.
Oh, yeah.
And do you know where Horace Mann was born?
Cambridge?
In Franklin. In Franklin.
I know the Boston Public Library, as I understood it, developed as an adjunct to the public education system.
Yes.
Because there was elementary, there was secondary,
Yes.
and then there was nothing.
That's right.
And it filled the gap for the nothing.
Well, in the book, I quote Mann, who said, "Public libraries are so important to public education that I would sow them across the land." So you're right. And the vignettes show that public libraries, especially in the big cities, develop for that reason, so that people could continue their education. But in other locations throughout New England, public education was not widespread. People only generally got through primary school. And many people, especially women, had no education at all. So another reason that they developed here was because something else developed here, and that was the Industrial Revolution. Now, what do industrialists need?
Workers.
Yes. They need machinery or capital, and they need workers in the building.
Materials.
And the first workers that went into these factories along the Blackstone River in southern Massachusetts and Rhode Island, not far from Franklin, and other places, had virtually no education because they typically came from rural areas where conditions were rough, and they hadn't had any schooling at all. So several of the early libraries in kind of this period, the Otis in 1850, the MacArthur, were really founded by industrialists for the main benefit of their workers that they wanted to educate, that they wanted to at least be able to read. Because they realized as production became more sophisticated and output, they wanted output to go up to meet demand, that they couldn't do it with completely uneducated workers. So in the case of MacArthur, in Biddeford, Maine, they got most of their workers who were women from farms in Canada, who completely could not read, write, add anything. And the story is that one of those workers, who never married, she was a spinster, she donated her life savings, all of $3,000, to help create the book collection for the MacArthur Library. So here we're seeing the values that people, and there was self-interest there too, right? But one of the reasons that New England was the powerhouse of American economy for so many decades was that the leaders understood the value of public education and the value of continued education, or reaching people who never had the benefit of public education. So that's why it happened here. But turning back the historical page, my book tries to argue that it was because the Puritans settled New England and what they brought, the values they brought to America, you can directly link to why public libraries and public education flourished here first. Do we know the Puritans evolved over time into what denomination?
Congregations.
Exactly. And what was unique about that denomination? It's in their name. They self-governed. There was no hierarchy anywhere. Not in England, no place, not in the Vatican. They governed themselves.
That was true of the Quakers too, though.
Yes, and I mentioned that in the book. And that's one reason Pennsylvania had more public libraries early on than any other state outside New England. I would say even the Baptists in Rhode Island. Roger Williams. But that self-governing among the Congregationalists, I argue in the book, led to a emulation of that in what other institution that New England is known for? The town meeting.
Metalworking and farming.
No, the town meeting. Look, a lot of the same people who were members and leaders of the congregations were also, or became, leaders in the first town meetings. And those first town meetings were not governmental. They were groups of people that came together to decide things and to think about the common good of their community. Only later did town meetings become institutionalized as part of local governments. And it was many of these town meetings, Peterborough is probably the best example, that were instrumental in saying, yes, we're going to create a library here for our community. Now, lastly, civil society. Where do you think that, where that was created? In New England. And do you know who the father of civil society was? None other than Cotton Mather.
Who?
Cotton Mather, Reverend Cotton Mather, fundamentalist preacher of the 1700s.
He wrote several works in Boston on this concept of the common good. And Do you know who read them? Well, I'm not sure how many people, but the important person who read them was Benjamin Franklin's father. And Benjamin Franklin's father was the first to say, okay, we understand and appreciate this idea of the common good, and we're going to form these voluntary associations to promote the common good. And as a young man, before he left Boston for Philadelphia, Benjamin absorbed the writings and his father's actions and took that attitude with him to Philadelphia. So, that's why I argue all of this happened first in New Okay? I'll move on now to the section 2, which is this.
Can I make a suggestion for the next show? Add the years, the specific years up next to each one.
Okay, it's kind of hard to tell up here. Sure.
Yeah, with 50-year span, it's...
Okay. Annex 2 in the book has a table with each of the libraries showing when the town was created, when the library was established, who were the benefactors, who was responsible for that. It's surprising. Many of them were helped create public libraries because it was a memorial to their parents. That was the Conway Library, the Field Memorial Library. Marshall Field grew up in Conway, and he established that library, and still his foundation's payers still support that library to this day. There are other cases where people started a library in, well, why? They helped create libraries. J.P. Morgan helped create the library in Holyoke because that's where his father was born. The tiny library in Lisbon, where's Lisbon? It's off there. Lisbon, New Hampshire, was founded with the resources of Mr. Chandler, who went there. He became the publisher of the LA Times, and started TWA. He was, for a time, the most wealthy man in America. So people did it for various reasons, but sometimes it was sort of sentimental. So, as I talked about in the preface, the selection of the libraries was not random, it was purposeful. The first 4 are the first 4 in America. The ones that followed were picked for different reasons. I picked some locations because they're located in distressed cities or towns. Turners Falls, Athol, Lisbon, Holyoke. I picked others in the one in Norwich has the Norwich, Connecticut got onto the list because, I'm sorry, that was the one in 1850 that was created by industrialists, and for a time Norwich was very prosperous, shipbuilding capital. Today it's the most distressed small city in Connecticut. And so through the case study, I wanted to see if there was anything that the library was doing in response to that distress. So the library in Lexington I selected because my advisor said it was one of the best run libraries in New England as far as she was concerned. So I wanted to have a variety, but I want you to know that the selection of 16 includes historic libraries and libraries in a great diversity of towns and villages. the two in Vermont were selected completely randomly. Now, half of those 16, and this is coincidental, I didn't do it by design, half of the 16 are run by nonprofits, and half are run by towns. Completely coincidental. But part of the question I wanted to answer ultimately was, is there any qualitative difference between the libraries that are run by towns and cities and those run by nonprofits or civil society? Any qualitative difference? I had a little bias going in, thinking, well, if they're run by civil society, they're run by people who have more skin in the game and are possibly closer to the community because they're members of the community. But I must be honest, some of the best libraries were run by towns in Peterborough, in Franklin, and some of the best libraries, like in Holyoke, in Biddeford, are run by nonprofits. So I could not distinguish, honestly. As I write in the book, without naming names, 3 of the 16 libraries are struggling. Only 3. 2, not surprisingly, are in that cohort of distressed communities. 1 is in a community in the Berkshires that we wouldn't consider distressed, and it's run by a nonprofit. So if that tips the scale at all, it would be that libraries run by the town in distressed locations probably aren't as likely to be doing well. But I'll tell you, how many of you people have spent any time in Athol? That library is extraordinary. So just because you're in a distressed area doesn't need to mean that your library is going to struggle. So that was part of one of my conclusions. If you ever read the book, one other library I would mention besides the Munson would be the library in Ashaway, Rhode Island, which is a small town, which is middle, upper income, I'd say middle, quite small. And its creation story is fascinating. It was created by the same people in that town who were abolitionists, and that same major family that was behind the creation of that library, one of the members started the first biracial school in America, in Connecticut, that lasted all of 3 years before the public outcry. But at least she tried. But I give you that creation story as a marvelous one because it shows the types of values that people who often establish libraries, and both the benefactors were women in Ashaway, also support other things that we would associate with a well-functioning democracy.
Horace Mann, by the way, started the first college in America to take blacks and whites as equals.
Really?
It was Antioch in Ohio where I went. Oberlin had already opened in the 1840s, some 10 years earlier, but blacks and women at Oberlin were decidedly second class.
I see. That's really good to know. So, some people who read my manuscript said, well, you don't cover the public library, early public library movement in terms of African Americans in particular. And my response to that was, well, at that time, in New England, there weren't that many African Americans. They weren't discriminated against in terms of being able to go into the early libraries. And the main benefactors of many of these libraries were uneducated rural folks and the early immigrants that came in from Europe. And in fact, that library, the Otis Library in Norwich, it created a satellite library, a branch, if you will, in an area that was essentially part of the settlement house system for very poor workers. So it wasn't like public libraries in that day were ignoring the underprivileged. It's that in New England, that did not include a lot of African Americans. Okay, now let's move to the last section, which is sort of the future. My main takeaway here is that public libraries going forward, as our economy and society changes due to AI, robotics, demographics, growing older, could be a tremendous resource for lifelong learning. It could be the main source for lifelong learning. Polls show that 75% of adults consider themselves practitioners of lifelong learning. And Nicholas Kristof had a recent column in the New York Times where he said, the illiterates of the 21st century are not those who cannot read and write, but those who cannot learn and relearn. And as we move forward, relearning is going to become very important. And you might be thinking, well, we have colleges, we have community colleges, we have all these other institutions. But what you have to realize is that many of the locations in America that are going to be affected or are being affected by these changes do not have these institutions. They don't exist. But in virtually all of them, the public library does. And because all these public libraries are now interconnected as part of systems, you go into a public library in a tiny town up in the Berkshires like Peru, and you don't have a car, and that's the only library you can get to, you can get resources from the entire rest of the Commonwealth and beyond. So they have the potential of becoming a real hub for this lifelong learning. In fact, I won't go into that because we don't have time. The other main thing that section 3 of the book documents for the first time, can you see this? Okay. So this has never been done before, but what I've done is compare indices that are publicly available on well-being, opportunity, and Robert Putnam's social capital index from his famous book, Bowling Alone. And I showed the scores for each state in New England, and then for comparison, 3 other states in America. And the bottom line is you'll see that a number of the states in New England score very high in these indices, Vermont probably being the highest. Massachusetts was first here in the 2020 well-being indice. So you look at how they score on these indices, and you look at how poorly some of these other states score. They're at the bottom, right? And then, from the Institute for Museum and Library Support, Systems, which is a U.S. government agency, they survey libraries every year, every library in America. So that's where this data comes from. It shows the number of systems, what percentage is nonprofit, how many are located in rural areas, persons per system, books per capita, and so on. The correlation which you can see if you look for a few minutes at this table is that the states that score best over here have the best library support and use. Now, I can't say that there's a causation there, but there's definitely a correlation. At the top of the list is Vermont. So they don't necessarily expend the most per capita, but they have the highest number of books per capita. They have the smallest number of people per library. So you have a fewer number of people using libraries where they find a greater number of books per capita. For whatever reason, the highest expenditure per capita is in Ohio, and I wasn't able to figure out why that was. They also have a high number of visits, but in New England, Vermont again has the highest number of visits per capita. So people have more books, and they visit the library. Libraries today don't offer just books, they offer community programs. And in community programs, in fact, book circulation has been trending down. Use of library programs has been ascending. They're very important, especially in small towns. Vermont has almost 53 programs per 1,000 people, the highest in New England. Compare that with West Virginia, with only 15. Look at the internet access. Again, the highest in Vermont and the lowest in West Virginia. I feel like sending this book and putting a gun to the head of Joe Manchin and saying, "You're concerned about your state, Mr. Manchin? Look at this." Okay? So some of the places in America that need libraries the most are getting the least. Why is that? That's a question I will leave to others to determine. But the IMLS, who was aware of my research, was very interested in this data. They had undertaken some similar research. And it'll be interesting to see that when the book is reviewed by the Library History Roundtable, even though this is not history per se, whether the reviewers comment on this as well. Others that have read the book that I've heard from have found that very interesting. Okay, well that's pretty much it for the book. There's an epilogue, there's an appendix, there are 4 appendices. The last appendice, which I'm not showing, is a history of Andrew Carnegie and his support for public libraries, including several in the book.
Yeah, when did he get started, Carnegie? It would be nice to see, because I don't think any of his were on that list, right?
Yeah.
How late into the 19th century did he get started?
Around 1890.
Ah, pretty late.
Okay.
Yeah.
People, industrialists, wealthy people in New England were doing things for public libraries in many locations well before Carnegie did it, but for the same reasons. He started his largesse, his support, which was grand, huge in today's dollars, slightly before the progressive era started. So he was sort of taking some of his Gilded Age wealth and putting it to a use which he believed in, because as you know, he had like 6th grade education, and all of the rest of his learning was from books. He was able to go into the private libraries of some of the people he worked for and read through virtually every book they had. So here's the website, CommonPLACE / book online. It talks a little bit about me. It talks about what the book's major themes are. It has the annotated bibliography. There's an associated email server that we want to see used for discussion and so on. So if you have any more interest in the book after hearing this presentation, you can either get a copy, the library has a copy, or you can look first at the website and see if it intrigues you anymore.
And what is that illustration on your homepage?
That is the Franklin Library.
Oh, the city of Franklin.
Yeah, this is the first
You know what,
library.
for those of us not local, where is Franklin in the state of Massachusetts?
It's sort of on the outer beltway.
Uh-huh,
So it's a suburban commuter.
uh-huh.
Here is the interior of the Franklin with the books from Franklin that were donated. And the interior is completely covered by the most amazing murals that certainly exist in any other public library in America, including the ones in New York and Boston. Every wall has a mural on it. It is one of the most astonishing buildings. So to visit this particular library would be not only for historic reasons, but for aesthetic reasons. The other thing I'll say about the library, though, is you saw the original library made out of marble. It's essentially a shoebox. Well, the town grew and outgrew the library, and about 10 years ago, they realized they needed to expand it. And the expansion they put on that library, which is contemporary, and at the back of the building, so you don't see it from looking face on, is one of the best pieces of library architecture, and I was trained in the design skills, that I've ever seen. And likewise, the new expansion for the Peterborough Library in New Hampshire is extremely well done. So I wrote to the local paper last fall, about a year ago, in conjunction with the Jones expansion, and said, there are some really good examples of libraries that have executed expansions in our state that library leadership and the board and so on would benefit from looking at. Another one's in Holyoke. I mean, 20 minutes down the road. And I'll tell you, I got all the facts and figures. And the expansion that this library has in mind will make it a much larger library than any of these, with the one exception, and that is in Lexington, which is one of the wealthiest communities in the state, probably the most highly educated. And the cost estimates, and I know things rapidly escalated during the pandemic and so on, but the cost estimates for even this most recent expansion are considerably lower than what we have been seeing here. So I'm torn. You know, I question honestly why we need a library as large as what they're planning here, having seen libraries across New England and being able to compare them. So anyway, you can look through the photographs on the web page and that annotated bibliography. So do we have any questions? We've gone, I think, I've used all my time, but we've had questions back and forth.
Very interesting.
Very interesting, thank you.
Okay. This Arsenals of Democracy, Democratic Culture, I want to talk with the Jones and see if I can somehow figure out how to get a copy of this, if not this copy, available to other people in at least Massachusetts. I just find it astonishing that it's not.
Well, let's give our speaker a round of applause.